thank you for having me here today. Does everybody have a hand? You don't look like you have a hand. Is there a
No,
handout?
we don't.
I need the handout. You need the handout. All right. So so I very much look forward to having a conversation. I'm going to try to vamp here while I'm getting the handout going around. It's characteristic of my talks that I'm going to like throw a lot at you, but it's not that, I think it won't be that bad, but I want to get us to have the conversation. So I'll be, we're running through a bunch of stuff, but I think it's all totally comprehensive. And so the overarching theme for the week, as I understand, is the act of interpretation. And so what I'm interested in talking about today is the notion of perspective, my sort of take on the notion of perspective. I think of perspective as a particularly pervasive and deep form of interpretation, or you might think of it probably as like a background which conditions and generates particular interpretations that we have, right? So what I want to do today is sort of set out, just like gesture toward the kind of phenomenon that I'm talking about, which I take to be familiar to all of you. And then to give us an analogy with, so I'm talking about this idea of perspective. It's a handout which someone is desperately trying to hand to you. An analogy with perception, perspective literally construed. What is that supposed to mean? So try to understand this sort of touchy-feely, amorphous background phenomenon, interpretive phenomenon in terms of a literal, literal perception. And then give you like my theory of perception of perspective in a quick nutshell, and then just demonstrate some payoffs for that. Okay, so it's a sort of top of it. If and when I actually write the book that I was supposed to turn into the publisher 12 years ago, this will be like, whatever, a chapter or a couple chapters. All right, so you're with me? You got the handouts now? Everybody's got a handout. Okay, all right. So, much of our thinking, I think now I'm talking, you know what I'm talking about. So a lot of our thinking as we engage with the world in a range of domains is guided by the intuitive perspectives that we bring to bear on the parts of the world. They typically they're so pervasive and so amorphous that they lurk in the background. They're really hard to get a handle on, but they show up, I think, in two special ways. One is you see them at work in the framing devices that we often use to communicate. So especially things like metaphor, memes, mantras, various kinds of sort of touchstone modes of expression that we use, which are not especially or at all concerned to convey information or even a particular feeling, but rather to orient and express sort of a way of interpreting a scene or a topic. So some examples, hashtags are really good for this, hashtag Black Lives Matter, or hashtag blessed. A pair of, I'm trying to not token as many slurs anymore because it's depressing, wingnut, or feminazi, these are two taken from two different orientations. Slogans like, it's the economy, stupid, or minds are computers, right? So I think what all these have in common is that they don't just express a particular claim or a particular evaluation, but rather sort of an orientation toward thinking about a topic. Another place where we see clashing memes or clashing mantras, but also even without such framing devices, we see perspectives at work is in disagreement. Certain kinds of disagreement, interpretive, perspectival disagreements, are especially profound because they are not especially limited to or even at all clashes over information or particular evaluation, but again over this broader background. And so again, some touchstone examples that I take it should be especially salient to many of us these days are clashes about epidemiology. How do you think about viruses circulating rapidly and through the public, and what do you do about it? Policing, right? Some particular person is shot on the street by a police officer. What are the causes? What are the explanations? How should we feel about it? What broader situation is that exemplary of? Those are both, political cases that have become political and that we have political disagreements about. We also have, this kind of perspectival disagreement showing up in much more localized contexts. Like, I promise this is not a case, disagreement over who unloads the dishwasher when and why, right? So in a context of a relationship, particular disagreements might matter not so much because of their particularity, but because of what they exemplify about a broader pattern, a broader clash of perspective. Similarly, some of the disputes about tenure votes that I've been a party to have involved not so much judgment about particular cases, particular facts, particular details, but rather about, there's a sort of perspectival disagreement there. So those are interpersonal, but more local than the political cases. And then there are cases where there's just difference, but it's not, so practical as these other kinds of cases. So, one of the things we love about some of us who actually do things like see movies, love about it, is debating with other people about the interpretation. And, that's, again, often partly a broader kind of perspectival disagreement about, or, conversation about interpretation. Also very abstract, I think a lot of what philosophy is a kind of perspectival, debate about, so if you think about what's at stake in disagreements, philosophical disagreements about like the nature of minds or the nature of justice, right? A big significant part of what's going on there is, I think, clashes of perspective or disagreement in perspective. So that's sort of, again, gesturing toward the quarry, the kind of phenomenon I'm interested in. In these cases of perspectival disagreement, I take it you have two agents, at least. They are agreeing largely, and we can sort of idealize and say entirely, about a particular body of information, about a particular topic, but yet they differ in their interpretation of that body of information, in particular in their explanations and predictions and evaluations of the topic. So there's a broader background disagreement. In ways, and it's not just this particular thing that they're disagreeing about, it's that these particular evaluations and predictions and explanations are systematically correlated with differences in their interpretations and explanations of other domains as well. So that's just to give you a flavor for what a perspectival disagreement would be, and I'm using that to highlight what I think a perspective is. These kinds of disagreements are, they're slippery, they're frustrating. It can be exciting when they're sort of fun about aesthetic topics, but they're very slippery, they're hard to pin down because they're not about particular matters of fact or even evaluation. They're profound, they're very deep because they're about these assumptions that are lurking in the background. One thing that I think is characteristic of these is each agent explains they can explain everything that they take to be the data and the intuitions in ways that they find compelling, right? They're happy with their interpretation, and yet the difference in interpretation persists. And in a way that adds up to a kind of substantive disagreement. So, I'm a philosopher, primarily a philosopher of mind, also a philosopher of language. So I think that an adequate philosophy of mind, an adequate theory of mind in general, needs to explain this kind of phenomenon. This is an interesting, important phenomenon, and I think it's something that needs to be thought about and understood. Moreover, these things that I'm talking about are not just cognitive noise. So people, cognitive scientists, psychologists, philosophers of mind, who pay attention to this kind of phenomenon, of this kind of persistent disagreement, these kind of like gut intuitive interpretations that are not reducible to particular judgments of fact or evaluation. One strategy, current strategy especially now, for dealing with this kind of these kinds of differences is to say that all this sort of interpretive stuff is mere noise, right? There's sort of a gut intuitive mode of interpretation which is layered on top or primordial beneath our real rational faculties of understanding, and the task of philosophy is to like really just focus on the rational stuff, right, and make those judgments. I think that's an impoverished model of minds and of rationality, and so part of what I want to do is explain what perspectives are in such a way that we can understand them as genuine contributors to understanding, genuine aspects of our rational agency, but also which can produce this kind of persistent disagreement, which can look where you look irrational to me, right? I feel that you are, engaged in being swamped by a bunch of what looks to me like cognitive noise, but I, of course, am perfectly rational. So I want to explain that pattern of interaction. So that's my modest goal for the next, 45 minutes. The place I think that to even start on making sense of this kind of disagreements and what these kind of disagreements and what we should do about them is we need to have something to say about what perspectives are, right? So part of the problem, part of the interest is that they're so complex, they're so amorphous that it's hard to even get a handle on them, right? Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say something about this analogy with actual perception and then make this transition to what cognitive perspectives are, perspectives understood in cognitive terms. All right, you're with me? You still got the hand up? You're okay. All right. So, perceptual, in talking about this kind of phenomenon, perceptual talk is extremely natural. We have a lot of different terms. We talk about a perspective. We also talk about a point of view. We talk about standpoints or orientations. We talk about, worldview or Weltanschauung. We talk. Also, there are other things that are not so clearly perceptual, but I think I'm just going to say these is all part of the same kind of thing I'm talking about. Paradigms. Let me see if there's any other. Whatever. You know what I'm talking about. But a lot of these terms involve a kind of perceptual metaphor. So part of what I understand is why that metaphor is so compelling and why it is governing so much of our talk. But it is a metaphor, right? A lot of the kinds of cases to which we apply this talk about clashing perspectives are abstract phenomena that you can't actually see. Or if they are phenomena that you can see, it's not the literally perceptual aspect of it that is even most important or that guides the, okay. So a couple of examples I've used are, when Romeo asks you to, see Juliet as the sun, or thing, he's not asking you to envisage her as the glowing orb in the sky. There's some other kind of more cognitive act of interpretation he's asking you to perform, and that's the case where you could probably see her as the sun if you really imagine her as looking like a sun if you really wanted to. And then, when Shakespeare asks you to think that life is but a walking shadow, right? That is not the kind of, there just is no envisaging to do that. So we're using a metaphor, but it's a very powerful metaphor. So what are the aspects of similarity that we want to hold on to make sense of this metaphor with perspective and seeing it? So I think a very fruitful place, the sort of default place to start, is with the literal notion of point of view. Just the idea of being located, at a place in a scene, right? So you have a point of view, right? And what I'm going to mean by that is an indexical representation, a representation which is indexed to a certain location of a target situation. So a representation of a target situation which is anchored at a particular location relative to some larger structure, right? Some embedding structure. So I've given you this cute, picture of, which is using perspective to illustrate how perspectival drawing works on the handout. So this simple idea of fairly simple idea of literal point of view gives us a bunch of things that I think people are gesturing at when they're talking about perspectives in this interpretive sense, cognitive sense. It gives you the sense in which what we're talking about is not just what is being given, what information you're thinking about, but something about how you're accessing that information. So in particular, we have different aspects of the topic, of the domain which is being represented, are more or less accessible in different kinds of ways. Some are closer, others are further. The information, there's a center of interpretation, and then some things are peripheral. There's a limitation, there's aspects beyond which I cannot, perceive, right? I can see some of the scene given where I'm oriented, but not other aspects of the scene. I'm given a lot at once, right? I'm given like an entire scene with lots of pieces of information in relation to one another, right? So I don't just see that this is true and that is true, that there is a man lying on the floor in the middle of the room. I see just where he's lying, how he's oriented to the walls, how far from each direction he is, where there's a window. So I see a lot of pieces of information in specific relation to one another. That's, there's a richness and a fine-grainedness to the interpretation that seems to be given to me. So I think that's great. Those are all parts of things we want to capture, probably in a notion of perspective. Another thing that I think we get from this notion of point of view is a way of thinking about perspectives as types, the kinds of things that can be shared across agents. So you and I could share, there's a common perspective insofar as we are located at a common point on a common scene, right? So there's an idea of commonality perspective in virtue of having a shared location. We can also make sense, thereby, of a notion of distinctness of types, right? You and I can be accessing the same scene, but differing in our perspectives insofar as we're located at different locations, right? We have different information is more or less accessible to us. There are different limitations on what we're able to access, all that. So that's all great. One thing that's going to be important to me and that's not built into that notion so far is that so far I just talked about a representation of a target situation anchored at a particular location. That's a static phenomenon. That's just like a snapshot, right, point of view. What we need something, part of what's I think important about a notion of perspective is that it's something that guides interpretation on an ongoing basis. That's pretty easy to build into this idea of point of view, and that's part of I think what's implicit in a notion of point of view. It's not just a particular snapshot, but a place from which one accesses whatever comes by, right? So the guy standing at the door in the back of that room has one point of view on the scene, and the person, the point of view of the viewer in this little diagram has a different point of view on the scene. And whatever happens inside the room, if the guy lying on the floor gets up and starts moving around, they're going to have different points of view on that scene. So we have a dynamic notion of how point of view determines and conditions interpretations, access to information, sort of on an ongoing basis. So we need to add that in, but I think we can still get that from this little notion point of view. Okay? So, good place to start, the idea of point of view. For my purposes, our purposes, of trying to make sense of what a perspective is in this interpretive, sort of cognitive sense, this less literal, perceptual sense, we need to do something more. So we need to shift from this perceptual thing to these abstract domains, things that can't be perceived that we're trying to interpret. Here, I think part of the clarity that we get from the idea of point of view makes it challenging to make that transfer. So in particular, we need to generalize the notion of literal access to a scene and the idea of a literal embedding structure, right? A spatio-temporal embedding structure, which is what we have in the case of perception. We need to transfer that to some other kind of perspective, some other kind of notion of structure, such that we can think of an agent being at a location within that structure and all the information that's being represented being arrayed in that structure. You might think that part of what, say, Frege is doing when he's talking about senses of concepts, or part of what other philosophers of mind and language are doing when they're talking about inferential roles, a network of assumptions and sort of entailment relations that set up a conceptual structure. You might think that's part of what you're doing there. I don't know, you have to make good on that metaphor of a structure, a conceptual structure, in a way that permits the notion of point of view and accessibility, these things I was talking about. But that is part of what Frege is saying. He's saying that when he talks about a Fregean sense is a mode of presentation and access to, I don't know how many people care about Frege, but a mode of presentation.
Very many. Please go on.
A mode of presentation and access to a situation which two rational agents might differ in their judgments despite being thinking about the same thing. So when I'm thinking about point of view here, I'm thinking partly about sort of Frege senses. So, but you have to make that transfer, and you have to, in order for the notion to have any tractability, you have to have an embedding structure that you can sort of define up as the thing in which the agents are, you know, differently located. You might also think maybe that, so when like Levi-Strauss or Bourdieu or whatever people are talking about social structures, that's another way in which you might think where you have an agent embedded in one place within a larger structure, and that conditions and drives their interpretations in different kinds of ways. But again, you have to do this thing of making good on the idea of a structure and a location such that that determines or drives or guides or whatever what the interpretation is, right? I feel like we know what we're talking about when we're talking about spatiotemporal structure. That's an explanatory burden you're taking on the discharge if you're going to really milk this analogy, right? So it's promising, but good luck with really, you know, working it all out, just using that. Another thing that I think I don't know how, not everybody is going to share this intuition, but a thing that I feel is, partly from the examples that I started with, is even if you could make good on those ideas of structure, say a conceptual structure or a social structure, you could define those out, and I think that there are differences of interpretation, perspectival differences, that go beyond differences in location relative to those structures, right? So it seems to me that the kinds of disagreements we get with, you know, on display with fights about dishwashers, or fights about, you know, whether a particular person deserves tenure or not, those are not fully adequately explained in terms of like positionality relative to these structures that we're sort of defining up. It seems to me that the kinds of types we need in order to understand differences of perspective are more fine-grained than the locations you're going to get from these kinds of structures. So not everybody's going to buy that. Some people are going to say, you know, just what it is to be an individual is to be located at a particular, you know, place in this kind of structure. Okay, if you know, but I have this intuition that something might go beyond. So that's one of the reasons I want to add some other theoretical resources here. Okay, so, and then I think you should want these anyway, even if, you know, you do think that interpretation is exhausted by, is entirely, not exhausted by, but entirely determined by one's location in these kinds of structures that you're defining. Okay, so the next thing I want to turn to, the next notion in perception that I want to turn to and sort of draw on and making sense of my notion of perspective at this intuitive cognitive level is the idea of an affordance. The sort of not just how something is presented as opposed to what is presented, but a kind of how that goes beyond sort of access in a sense. So what I'm understanding here, the what it's like to access that in some way. Not just the what it's like that's given by this kind of spatial distance and temporal distance, but something more about how it is presented to you. Now, the notion of affordance that, you know, has less of the benefit of clarity and precision that's associated with point of view, but I think we can still get some important insights from it. So I think of it as something like experiential coloring, how it, you know, feels to you, how it shows up for you. The pictures I've got on the handout here are the main protagonists of The Wizard of Oz. When they enter the Emerald City, they put on these green goggles so that they see everything under a green light. So that's partly, you know, their seeing is conditioned by this sort of like coloring, this mode of interpretation. I've also got here a bat and some vampire teeth to evoke Thomas Nagel talking about what it's like to be a bat, and Laurie Paul more recently talking about, you know, sort of transformative experiences, what it's like to be a vampire. You know, a vampire's like, oh, look at that neck. It's like, look at that neck. It calls out to me. You know, so what we get from the idea of an affordance is different agents are going to different aspects of the world. They're going to parse the world into different sort of salient kinds, right? So what's Salient for the dog is he trots down the street and smelling his smells and, you know, seeking his things and wanting to pee in his places is different than what shows up for me and what's salient to me, right? So different categories of kinds of things are going to be salient, are going to pop out, they're going to call for action in different kinds of ways for these different kinds of agents in virtue of their different forms of life, their different ways of inhabiting the world. So we have parsing. Part of what I think affordances do is parse the world into kinds. They prioritize, they select some kinds of things important, they evaluate them as like, you know, this is good or this is a threat, and thereby they motivate us to act in certain kinds of ways that are appropriate for us. So, you know, when I'm hungry or if I'm thirsty, the things back there are calling out for me to be grabbed and poured and whatever in a way that they wouldn't be if I didn't have those needs and interests. Okay, so what matters to me and how it matters, right, is what we get from the idea of affordances. So I think that is something I think we really want we should want to build into something like that. It's something we should want to build into the notion of interpretive perspective. I think that's part of what people are, you know, gesturing at when they use this, you know, this metaphor of perception. I have a concern about that. Like I think there's still something kind of missing when, especially if you think about what it's like in affordances. I think that there's a way in which it still seems kind of piecemeal. It's like, you know, that, you know, sorry, I won't attack your water bottle. Like that's calling out to me to be picked up and drunk from, you know. This other thing. So part of what we wanted was this, and we sort of got from the idea of point of view was this large embedding structure, right? And affordances don't seem exactly like that. So I feel like there's still something more that's needed. In particular, it's not just that everything hangs together in a structure of like sort of how it's given, but everything hangs together in a perspective. Part of what perspective does is help us to make sense of things as hanging together sort of interpretively. And particular affordances don't give us that. And a particular like point of view, you know, like how we access information, is it closer or more remote, doesn't yet, I think, give us that. So the last thing, the one that's dearest to my heart, but I think is you know, just a partial contributor here, is the idea of a gestalt, right? That's the last part of perception that I want to try to draw on. So I think of a gestalt as offering a holistic organizational structure, but it's now an internal structure rather than an external structure, right? So what we got from point of view was an external structure, an embedding structure like in the world in some sense, which I was placed within. And what we got from the notion of affordance was something like internal, something interpretive, but more piecemeal. Part of what a gestalt does is give you, you know, an interpretive structure, which is, so internal, it can be particular to a particular agent despite being co-located, but yeah, it's like a little bit of both. So what a gestalt does is I take it, integrate a collection of elements, the kinds of things that might be given, you know, under affordances. It integrates a collection of elements into a complex, significant whole, right? So everything hangs together with a given gestalt. A gestalt imposes a figure ground contrast. Some things are highlighted and some things are recessed. In a way that might differ from the sort of spatial distance or even conceptual distance that we got from point of view. And it manifests a tipping point of holistic implementation. So the example, that's why I put these figures on the handout, so I'm going to start with the rightmost one. So there's a way of seeing, I don't know how much this is going to work for how naive many of you are, and so whether it'll work, but there's a way of seeing the figure on the right on which it's like a collection of spots. If you can get the gestalt to lock in, then it becomes, you come to see it as a Dalmatian in a park with fallen leaves. That organizes, so I know I made it very small because I had to fit it on the handout, and as I was saying to Zed, my eyes are not as good anymore, and so it's challenging for me. But so if you go home and blow up the figure, and you can do it. So it looks like once you see it as a dog sniffing leaves in a park near a tree, all those just previously disconnected splotches hang together in a certain way. And are significant. They're contributors to different parts of the scene in different ways, whereas before they were sort of all apart. And one of the characteristics is, once you see it that way, you can't unsee it, right? It's no longer a meaningless collection of spots. You can't access it in that way. They do hang together for you in this compelling way. We see that even, well, there's a further complexity, or we see this also, really vividly, this way in which you implement interpretation, and then get this different ways of hanging together with the figure on the left, which is an ambiguous Gestalt figure, can be seen either as an old lady or as a young lady. Again, I don't know how naive people are, but in a room of this size, typically there are like 5 people or so who can only see the figure one way and not the other way. Part of what's really characteristic of that is, so basically I tell you a Dalmatian, well, usually it's pretty easy to, you can try to get the dog figure to go. Part of what's characteristic about the old lady, young lady figure is having that information, that it can be seen as an old lady, or that it can be seen as a young lady, does not suffice to get it to lock in, right? That is also somewhat true of the dog figure, but believing, trying to see it as an old lady, if you intuitively see it as a young lady, doesn't suffice to make it happen, right? And that kind of information can help. So is anybody stuck? Can anybody only see it one way? Yes, which way can you see it?
The young lady.
You can see the young lady, okay. So now let me tell you, you're trying to see it as an old lady. So take the young lady's nose. That's a wart on the old lady's nose. Take the young lady's, and we get that response, right? Take the young lady's necklace. It's the old lady's mouth, right? So having little pieces of information about how to interpret the scene can help, but sometimes, subjects are not as cooperative. It takes like a few pieces of information in order to get the transition. But something happened to you in perception. It fell into place and hung together in a different kind of way. When you can see it as depending on how you see it, the different elements have different significances, and different changes to the scene would make a different difference. So in particular, you can't get rid of, so for the old lady figure, the wart is like maybe kind of dispensable. It's not that important. Another version of the figure might not have the wart. But for the young lady, it's really important. You have it plays a really significant role in underwriting the possibility of that person. So different elements have different significances and play different roles in underwriting the whole on the 2 interpretations. All right? Okay. Thus I complete my section about the analogy with perception. So I talked about these 3 aspects of perception, and I'm going to try to draw in all of those to give you my theory of cognitive and interpretive perspectives. They're not going to be like nice layers. They're going to you'll be able to see how they show up in the account, but they're not like going to be like, oh, here's the point of view part, here's the, you just see how I'm drawing on all these analogies. Okay, so this is going to be the densest part of it. Section 3 is but hang on, we'll get there, and then I'll go into the payoff, okay? And the timing, I think, will work out. So let's start as we did in the case of perception with the static, particular interpretation, right? So directed at a particular body of information about a target topic, a perspective delivers what I call a characterization, which is an intuitive construal, a way of thinking about an interpretation of that body of that topic, which integrates a rich collection of representative attributed features, often including images and feelings. So when in my characterization of Joe Biden, I have to keep on updating, as the presence changes. There are these features of the aviator glasses and the sort of there's something about his sort of stance. Those are aspects of they're part of my intuitive characterization of Joe Biden. There's something about his pattern of speech, which is kind of a little slurry, a little stuttery. So those are, there's also feelings, like, I guess it's all very confessional, but, I feel sort of a kind of grandpa feeling toward him, like I feel warm, I'm wishing him well, I'm a little nervous, like, is he gonna make it downstairs, I'm impressed when he does, so those are, images and feelings that are showing up that are part of my intuitive construal about Joe Biden. Kind of even if I wish they weren't, right? Like, notice I don't want to be thinking about it. I don't think I should be thinking about it in some of these ways, but those are, I'm confessing to you, those are parts of my intuitive understanding of the construal of it. So, integrating a rich collection of features, often including images and feelings, into a multidimensional structure. I'm going to say more about that, multidimensional structure. The touchstone place to get started with this, I think, is by thinking about stereotypes. But stereotypes, I take it, are intuitive ways of thinking about social kinds, women, black people. We can, as you see, have characterizations of individuals, and they need not be culture-wide, right? They could be my particular construal. They're related to what many psychologists think of as concepts. But because I'm a philosopher, especially a philosopher of mind and language, I think of concepts as much more like representational atoms that compose with other concepts to form whole thoughts, propositional thoughts, but that's another topic for another day. They're also a bit like what people sometimes talk about as conceptions. But I want to emphasize the way in which they're rich and intuitive and include stuff, feeling and affect and imagery in ways that might not be fully rational, in a way that conception sounds more rational. Okay, so that's characterization. So and that's like what we get, a characterization of a particular scene, right? It's an intuitive presentation, construal of a particular scene. And then, as we did before, we're going to add the notion of dynamics, like the ways in which a perspective guides interpretation over time. A perspective then, for me, is a disposition to interpret. It's a disposition to form characterizations of topics as one goes about the world. And in particular, I understand it's a style of noticing, relating, and responding to the world as one encounters it. So now you're going to flip the page, and I'm going to say something about noticing, relating, and responding. Okay? Okay, so the first thing is the noticing. So attention plays a crucial role, is this fundamental aspect of perspectives. So attention focuses on, for an agent, on information of certain kinds. So what attention does, among the things it does, is parse a manifold into types, categories of repeatable instances. Different agents are going to use, I am given a manifold of lower level features, and part of what attention does intuitively in perception and also in non-perceptual interpretation is clump that and say, this is an instance of this kind of thing, right? That's a red sweater. That's a man. That's a homeless guy, right? Gives us types of things that we're encountering on repeated ways. So parses lower level features relative to a presupposed taxonomy, a set of concepts or types of things which one can instance. And that taxonomy itself assumes certain purposes. Different taxonomies are useful for, are in the service of different kinds of goals. There's a sort of, say, the taxonomy used by civil engineers in building, bridges and other kinds of buildings. There's a taxonomy of sort of, delicious and non-delicious foods, right? I mean, those are different taxonomies, right? Different ways of parsing phenomena in the world. Those might overlap, they might not overlap in what they apply to. So a taxonomy assumes certain kinds of purposes, and also a taxonomy presupposes a certain distribution of lower level features. It assumes these sorts of features clump together in certain kinds of ways, right? People who have hair like this and wear this kind of clothing and hold their bodies in this kind of way are women, right? People who have these other lower level features, those are men, right? So it's these lower level features. I assume that these lower level features are clumped together in certain kinds of ways and are, okay, so part of what attention does is give us not just a blooming, buzzing manifold, but instances of certain kinds of features and individuals. And then within that, it selects some for attention at all, to even show up to consciousness. The most famous example of this is the invisible gorilla. So depending on your purposes, if you're tasked with counting the number of basketball passes among a group of people who are passing a basketball, if that's your job, your attention is directed in such a way that you don't even notice the actor wearing the enormous gorilla suit who's walking through the crowd. By contrast, if you are not given that task, then the gorilla is incredibly salient to you, right? So differences in one's purposes make a difference. In either case, both normal agents will parse that there's a gorilla, but only for one of those agents does the gorilla show up for conscious attention. Is it selected for attention? And then within those things that are selected for attention, those objects and features which are selected for attention, which are noticed by the agent at the conscious level, some they're prioritized in different ways, right? Some really are salient and show up and prominent in your thinking, and others are not so prominent, right? I understand prominence as a function of two further features, and here I'm following Amos Tversky, 1978. He thinks of prominence, he calls it salience, two features, intensity and diagnosticity. Intensity is signal-to-noise ratio, like how bright a light is relative to the other light in the room, say. Diagnosticity is sort of classificatory utility. How useful, relevant, salient is this feature for your purposes, right? So a very bright light will attract your attention, but likewise something that isn't like inherently very intense might attract your attention or drive your attention because it's really relevant for you. So in particular, if you know that elliptical pupil shape is roughly correlated with whether a snake is venomous, and you're interested in not getting bitten by poisonous snakes, then the sort of shape of the eye will jump out to you in a way it wouldn't if you didn't know that, right? Because that feature is highly diagnostic of something that you really care about, okay? So both intensity, so prominence is a function of intensity and diagnosticity. Both intensity and diagnosticity are context relative, as I just tried to illustrate. And they're also often, typically, cognitively mediated. They're mediated by your background assumptions. The snake's pupil eye already sort of illustrates that. But other examples might be like, ways in which one's background assumptions can make a difference. So another example that I really like is, paintings of the Virgin Mary for, much of the history of Western painting would be in this very bright blue, right? That's just an intense color of blue, and so it calls attention, and that was a way of directing attention to Mary for the adoration of her, because that's appropriate given the religious background. But it was also, made using Lapis Lazuli. Lapis Lazuli is like incredibly expensive, and so that was itself a signal that the patron had the money to put up the paint. And so the use of that color is extra diagnostic, right? It's diagnostic in a certain way. It's not just intense, it's also diagnostic. And that same color, that same saturation and hue of blue is going to show up differently in different paintings depending on what else is around it, how bright the other pigment is around it, and also, is it characteristic for paintings of that genre or not, right? It's going to be really surprising in, say, an Impressionist painting in a way it wouldn't be in a Renaissance painting, right? So contextual background, the surrounding scene, the inherent intensity relative to the rest of the scene, and one's background assumptions can all sort of guide how much your attention is directive to how prominent this thing is. All right? Okay, so we got attention, parsing, selecting, and prioritizing information in the world. But perspectives don't just give us like ordered lists of features, right? Most prominent to least prominent features. They also connect those features, goodbye, in complex ways. So into complex networks of what I call centrality, and here I'm following Thagard and Sloman, so other people who've talked about, psychologists who've talked about immutability. So there are a variety of ways in which, different kinds of grounds on which particular features that I attribute can be connected to one another. So they can be connected just in a sort of boring way by logical implication or by material implication. I know because in virtue of thinking of somebody as a bachelor, I know that I also attribute them that they're unmarried. But lots of the grounds of connection we attribute between features are, causal connections, maybe just correlations. I expect something even though I don't cause it. They're aesthetic connections or moral connections. I think somebody deserves certain kind of other feature because, like the bank robber should get a broken leg because of the bad thing he did or whatever, yeah, and also aesthetic, right? So I think I see this a lot in like Roald Dahl. So because of the kind of inner character of the character being described, the inner personality, it should be manifest. They should have big warts on their nose, and it should be whatever. Or the heroine should be blonde, and whatever, right? So these certain kinds of features are aesthetically appropriate given certain kinds of others. We have these kinds of connections, motivations, ways of connecting and expecting different features to hang together in virtue of our experience, like statistical experience, but also these other kinds of grounds. One thing that's really important and distinctive is we're not very good at determining and sussing out what the grounds for connection are that we are imputing. So we just think like we associate features in our thinking intuitively in these construals, and then we sort of impute some ground to make us feel good about making that connection, right? So we seek a kind of justificatory basis for an intuitive connection that we make, and so we're prone to overestimate statistical correlations between, say, stereotype conforming features, or to impute a causal basis for certain kinds of correlations we take to obtain, even if they might just be contingent correlations. All right, so I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, and then in virtue of having parsed and selected and prioritized and connected all of these complex features in various kinds of ways, we then are motivated to respond in a range of kinds of ways, right? It makes sense to us that given what kind of thing, my overall interpretation, I'm going to respond in this way. The patterns of response might be various. Again, there might be, practical response. It calls out for grabbing to me. It calls out for fleeing. I see a man, I see a figure in a dark alleyway. I parse it as a man. I parse it as a homeless man. I feel threatened. I want to run away, right? Like that's an intuitive, quick gut reaction in virtue of a whole constellation of associations and features in this kind of way. Again, with the confessional aspect. So we have patterns of response. They might be practical, they might be moral, right? I have a gut disgust or an admiration or whatever for a certain kind of scene or a situation or an individual in virtue of how I'm the rest of my characterization. They might be aesthetic, right? The kinds of responses and questions. So we have a range of kinds of responses which are conditioned and follow upon our particular characterization which is formed, which is itself a function of the perspective that we have that guides the production of those characterizations. Okay? You made it. That's my little, nutshell characterization of what a perspective is. Perspectives, so understood, differ from propositional attitudes like belief and desire, at least as philosophers standardly construe them, in, what do I give you? I've given you 3 kinds of ways. First, as I emphasized, they're open-ended tools for thinking rather than thoughts per se. And so these are things that are going to explain why we have persistent disagreement even in the face of agreement about information. So perspectives are open-ended tools for forming and updating thoughts rather than being particular thoughts. They're styles of attention and connection and response, which then get applied to particular bodies of information as they come in. They're open-ended in at least two ways, typically. One is they apply to multiple topics. It's not just my encounter with this figure in the alleyway right now, but a whole range of interactions I have with a range of individuals and whatever. So open-ended across topic, and also open-ended across time. If I get new information, how does that change and update my perspective, my particular characterization? So a perspective guides my interpretation in an open-ended way across topics and across time. Further, perspectives differ, and the deliverances of perspectives, characterizations differ from propositional attitudes standardly understood in being very rich, dense, and degreed, having like fine-grained degrees of like how, having these images which are more fine-grained in particular than just categorical concepts, but also like how intense was my feeling? How much more prominent is this thing in my thinking than those things? Finally, and this is in a way the most important thing for me, as I tried to illustrate with the Gestalt figures, entertaining or even endorsing a perspective or the deliverance of a perspective, a particular characterization, is neither necessary nor sufficient for having a perspective. So in both directions. So you see, on the one hand, I might like really want and endorse, just as I could want and endorse to see the figure as a young lady and not be able to do so. So I might really want to be able to like intuitively construe electricity in terms of a hydraulic model of of flow, and just not be able to do it because I haven't implemented, I haven't locked into that intuitive mode of construal where you give me a piece of information, I can interpret it in the relevant way and respond appropriately. Correlatively or conversely, I might be saddled with a perspective that I don't endorse, right? I might really want to be a good ally for women in the workplace, and yet my gut responses might be parsing and responding in ways that depart from that, right? Might not notice certain features, or notice certain other features, or overestimate certain features, to have certain gut responses, right? So I can be saddled with a perspective that I don't endorse. So entertaining or endorsing perspectives is neither necessary nor sufficient. Oh, and the other kind of example I want to use here is that, it might be, it's characteristic, I take it, of being evangelical. So here's a doctrine that's associated with being an evangelical Christian. Belief that Jesus Christ as God is the only route to salvation, right? That's like supposed to be what's definitive of being a evangelical Christian. That's a proposition. It's associated with a perspective, but it's like 50%, 55% of evangelical Christians don't believe that. But there's still, the Pew study says, but they have the perspective of an evangelical Christian, despite not endorsing that perspective, right? Similarly, you could just endorse that perspective, but not to get the intuitive way of thinking of evangelical Christians that guides their intuitive interpretation going on. All right, so even if there is a particular proposition which can be endorsed, that's not neither necessary nor sufficient for having a perspective. Okay, now what I'm going to do, we started late, it's 5 minutes to 11. I'm going to say a bit of the payoff, but I do want to have a conversation, so I'm going to go through that. Not even faster than I was doing, but okay, and I suspect that for many of you, this is going to be where I'm going to sound like most like a philosopher. You're going to be like, you're wrong. So, okay, so the first thing I want to say is that I think that this encounter perspectives can help us to understand the distinctive profile of benefits and risks that perspectives bring with us. They're not just cognitive noise, but they have real perils, cognitive perils associated with them. So in particular, perspectives, I think, are essential for us as agents, as finite agents navigating complex world in real time. We have to select information. We have to be selective. we have to respond rapidly, and we need to make sense of things, you know, sort of in light of that, in ways that are answerable to our particular purposes and assumptions. So perspectives help us to navigate complex information in real time in concert with our goals so that we know our way around and how to go on. We're not at sea. We don't have to start ex novo each time. We, you know, sort of have a default mode of processing information as we encounter it. And that all affords genuine understanding. That is understanding the world. I even think that this is something that ideal agents, not just us finite beings in real time need, but also an ideal agent. But we can talk about that down the road. They would still have to parse and want to connect, need to connect information. And as a result of that, because of the way that perspectives work, because they select and connect information that makes intuitive sense to us, when we have a perspective that's decently well-functioning, perspectives are self-perpetuating and self-justifying, right? We're able to assimilate the information we encounter into coherent networks that guide our interpretation and therefore action in ways that are answerable to our assumptions and needs, right? That's like, it's nice, that's good, we need it and it works. However, from an alternative, so that's the benefits. From an alternative perspective, we might seem, and in fact be, complacent and myopic and even perverse, right? So all I see is the things that I'm noticing and how I can synthesize them into coherent networks and respond appropriately. But what you might see is everything that I'm ignoring and the inconsistencies in my patterns, my networks of explanation, and therefore what you take to be my inappropriate patterns of response. And again, I think this is a kind of inherent risk. So attention has to be selective, but therefore we're not even noticing the unknown unknowns, right? And we're not even noticing that we're not noticing things. And so we're like, yeah, I got it all. Like, I'm doing good, right? Confronted with a putative counterexample, if we have a good, pretty decently well-functioning perspective, we're able to explain it away as a mere anomaly, right? Where I don't take it to be a devastating counterexample because I take it just to be a marginal little, you know, anomaly. Similarly, it's in the nature of explanation, I think, that it goes beyond the evidence we actually have. We impute a causal basis when we can't see a causal basis. All we can observe, as Hume says, are correlations. And so explanation has to go beyond the evidence we have, but we might impute bases that are not warranted. And I think that's some, you know, and it might be obvious from somebody else's perspective that that's happening. And then finally, I think this is one of the risks, satisfyingly schematized interpretation may be seductively simplistic conspiracy theory. So part of what's so satisfying about having a perspective is that everything hangs together. And part of what we find very it feels good, it has that gestalt click, that gestalt feeling. And part of what's especially satisfying is like to have one principle. And this is it's a scientific virtue, have one or a few principles that make everything hang together. And you get it, and you're like, yes, now it all makes sense. But that may be a kind of seduction. Life may actually be more complicated than that. And in particular, I think there's a risk here of the sort of zealotry of the converted, right? So when people describe coming, like, you know, people who leave conspiracy theories having entered them often say, you know, and then it seemed to me like it all made sense. If the moon landing was faked, then, you know, or whatever, QAnon, you know. So, and then they like gradually understood that it's just not that simple, right? So I think that's really characteristic. So those are the profile of risk, benefits, and risks. Part of what I'm especially interested in is explaining persistent perspectival disagreement despite like informational agreement, right? So I think it should be pretty clear how we can get that kind of even rational perspectival disagreement that persists. Two agents encountering the same scene, maybe parsing the same set of lower level features into different categories, into different kinds. And they might be doing that because they're using different taxonomies. They might be drawing, like the world might have, you know, these sort of more continuous distributions of features that are sort of clustering together. they might be cleaving them at different purported joints where the joints are not as absolute as the categories suggest, and they might be drawing the lines at different places. And or in the service of different explanatory and practical aims. So one of my favorite examples of this recently is the difference between the CDC and the FDA in thinking about the efficacy of vaccines and whether to get vaccines, what it would take to improve the vaccines. This FDA is concerned with personal individual health and safety for an individual. The CDC is concerned with safety for a population. And so they were driven by different concerns and had different taxonomies of some of their operative categories, like safe and effective, but also things that are less obviously value-laden, like airborne. Okay, so, or outdoor. There was a really interesting way in which part of what was happening was differences in the definition of outdoor in the scientific studies about weather effects and risk of transmission. Okay, so we have different taxonomies, different purposes driving those taxonomies. Two agents might agree about a local body of facts, but disagree about the global distribution of features outside of that situation, right? They might agree that here, this is what's happening, but think that that's exceptional because the background statistics are different, or think, no, this is exemplary of exactly how things are elsewhere. They may draw different kinds of connections or connect features on different kinds of grounds. So an example here that I like is two people might agree that not just that Jane is cooperative, but also that women are cooperative, but disagree about what the basis for that is. One might think it just is a result of contingent socialization in this particular culture. Another person might think that it's the result of a biological endowment. Or in between, they might think it is contingent but follows from deep features about how cultures have been created over time in virtue of distribution of labor around child rearing or something like that, right? So those are different. You might agree about an attribution of a particular feature or even a generic claim, and yet disagree about the bases, the grounds for that. And you might therefore disagree in your evaluations of how you evaluate responses to them. Finally, you might just endorse different values, or endorse the same values but these two agents, or prioritize the same values in different ways. So again, with the pandemic, one thing that was really interesting was the difference between, so if you compare Moderna and Pfizer, Pfizer was looking for the lowest effective dose in order to maximize safety, whereas Moderna was looking for the highest dose in order to maximize efficacy that would still be safe, right? And so that drove their research profiles and what they were doing in slightly different ways, right? And then meanwhile, Johnson & Johnson is looking to use demonstratedly safe, familiar, sort of mechanisms in order to, so these are different priorities. Everybody wants to be safe and effective, but they're prioritizing. Last thing, and here's definitely where I think people are is likely to disagree. I think that finally this account of perspectives can help us to assess perspectives, to say why one perspective is better or worse than another, and what we can do to improve or ameliorate the perspectives that we have. So here are some constraints, I think, on good perspectives. They should impute actually instantiated features, which are, so things that you should be attributing to people, and things in the world, features they actually have, right? So I shouldn't be willy-nilly going around attributing to women a whole host of properties, those women that they don't have, just because I've got a stereotype about what women are like, right? That's a problem if you're doing that. So you should be imputing actually instantiated features. Features which are themselves parsed using a taxonomy that reflects how lower level features really are kind of clustered in the world, and how they interact with one's purposes. So again, going back to this issue about outdoor, there were these studies that were, whether COVID transmitted outdoors, there were these different definitions of outdoor, and airborne, right? 5 meters versus, and that was a definition of airborne, which was inherited from tuberculosis, but was actually not at all relevant or efficacious for thinking about COVID. And it took a long time to figure that out, just because people had this set taxonomy, a definition of what airborne meant, which was driving their assumptions and their debates, but didn't actually make an interesting, useful cut in the space of distances. You might think the kind of people have sometimes have critiqued the idea of the notion of felon, right? So a felon categorizes individuals into kinds in ways that people have argued are oppressive and not reflective of significant differences among people that should be significant. Okay, so you should impute actually instantiate features using a good taxonomy. A taxonomy reflects what you actually care about. So if I end up, you should also be paying attention to the features that matter relative to your own perspective, right? So if I am surprised when a woman wearing scrubs on the schoolyard turns out to be a doctor rather than a nurse, that's a problem with my patterns of attention given my own avowed perspective, right? There's a disconnect between my intuitive pattern response and my avowed perspective. I should be bringing those into alignment, right? My perspective should impute connections that actually reflect structures in the world. Counterfactual, causal connections, or patterns of counterfactual, difference. What would happen if you were to take away this feature? How would the situation change? I should generate, my well-functioning perspective will generate consistent evaluative responses both within and across characterizations. So for instance, a lot of people wanted to criticize certain people's responses to large gatherings in the summer of 2020. So some got characterized as protests and others got characterized as riots. And the claim was those were functionally the same kinds of gatherings, but they were being assessed in different kinds of terms, subsumed under different kinds of characterizations in ways that were inconsistent, right? So that's a kind of criticism that I think we should be able to launch against perspectives. Is this lack of consistency. And then finally, I think we can criticize and should criticize perspectives on the grounds that they are employing purposes and priorities that we really shouldn't be using, right? And that, conversely, we can praise, say that perspective is apt to the extent that it is using actually valuable purposes and priorities. Like, people have criticized the idea of cute in girls' clothing, right? Or the idea of blasphemy. The idea of blasphemy is applying a concept which encodes a value, which we really should not be implying, right? That's a purpose, a classificatory and evaluative purpose that is not a good one, right? And so we can criticize a perspective on that basis. So, we all have perspectives. They're largely overlapping, somewhat different. How do I decide from the inside how apt my perspective is? That's the, $1,000,000, billion-dollar question. I am always already within my perspective, right? I can't, it has this internal, hopefully I should seek to achieve internal consistency and, sort of explanatory simplicity. I should also seek to be able to explain the widest range of phenomena possible. But if so, it's going to look good to me, right? But there's still this risk that I am complacent. I'm not noticing what I'm ignoring. I'm even using these perverted principles. How do I tell? There is nothing from the inside that I can do to test if I've achieved that kind of, if I've achieved that kind of internal coherence. There's nothing I can do, sort of by definition, to test whether, to definitively test whether my perspective is apt. The one thing to do is to achieve perspectival fluidity, to get good, to train myself up, to try on other perspectives and see what shows up, what kinds of connections, what kinds of categories are operative from these other perspectives, and to assimilate then what I can from those alternative perspectives. But again, that's still me from my perspective trying to encounter this other perspective and then trying by my own perspectively laden lights to sort of incorporate it into my own antecedent perspective or convert to a new perspective. And there again, there's no guarantee of aptness, right? So the sad reality is you can only do your best with the perspective you have. You are always already within a perspective. But it's not hopeless. You're not just stuck with the perspective that you were born into, enculturated into, or given by temperament. You can try to shift your perspective by being open-minded, especially by using art and science and history. So playful open-mindedness, sort of like trying on perspectives that you don't endorse, seeing how far you can get into those. But you need to also be aware that that's risky because you may be perverting yourself, either by conversion to a malign perspective or by this kind of just watching too much Fox News is bad for you. You train yourself into noticing things, you get, you are habituated to certain kinds of interpretive practices which may be malign, even if you still take them to be malign. So you've got to be careful. So playful open-mindedness, tempered by sober reflection. I think logic, I've emphasized here the ways in which perspectival interpretation exceeds and can differ from logical sort of operations, but we could use logic in order to sort of assess the extent to which we're being consistent in our connections and responses. We should also see what the world's actually like. We should use empirical investigation to see what statistical distributions are actually out there, test those. And finally, we should also engage in sincere conversation when we try to talk to people we trust and get them to see if they can, what did they lob at us that's hard for us to process, or, but we have to trust them in order to engage in that kind of sincere conversation. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. What?
Yeah.
You guys do it
Yeah, I
out.
start? Okay, good. Oh, well, thanks. Then I start. Okay, two questions. One maybe easier. On the Frege bit. Frege has a third term that typically people don't discuss between Sinn und Bedeutung, but it actually looms large in the writing, just that we oversee it. He calls it Färbung, coloring.
Exactly.
And Beleuchtung.
It's on my head now.
I know, experiential coloring. I know. And so, and Frege brings in coloring and all of this precisely because he thinks that senses are not perspectives. Not at all. I think that's quite important. Though I'm very interested. That's part of the debate that I've been having with Zed, and why we have this topic this year. To think of Fregean senses or something like Fregean senses in a perspectival way. But I think very clearly Frege does not want to do this because these would be psychological entities. And I don't think that Fregean senses are ways of accessing anything. Right, they're modes of presentation, but again, that's we're in a realm of interesting metaphor. But that's just flagging this.
Okay.
But he thinks that somewhere, right, he's unclear about this, but somewhere in the midst of the propositional, right, Färbung shows up. His example is of course something like unfortunately, right, or famously the difference between dog and mud. So that's the one thing. Just a little bit more about and Gottlob itself, exactly. And then the other thing is I wonder towards the end, right, to which extent, there's the problem of literal perspective and extending what we call a literal perspective into another realm. But towards the end of your presentation, I was wondering if there's such a thing as my perspective.
Right.
I think the perspectives that you were characterizing, right, they are too shareable in order to be my perspective. I think so. You diverge at a very important point from the, the indexicality, etc., right? And so I would like to hear something about how you reel this in again.
Okay, so I think your two questions are related.
Yeah, they are.
So I would say that, I would distinguish, I don't want to get too deep into Frege exegesis, but if you think about the relation, I'm going to call them ideas, so that we have ideas, senses, and references, right? And so if you think about the analogy of looking at it through a telescope at the moon, so the moon is a common object, that is what is being seen. We have a telescope stationed at a particular location, trained onto that. We have the sense is, by analogy, the image which is projected at the end of the telescope. So it's in the telescope, but it's on the glass at the end of the telescope. And then the idea is the retinal image in the eye, okay? So there are two things about ideas which make them different from senses. One is they're essentially private.
Yeah.
Even if I could set up a machine so I could look at your retina, I could never have your idea, because yours is in your head, mine is in my head, right? The other thing is, there are a lot of them, and they might not be all lined up, and there's a sea of them, and they drive feeling, and whatever, right? So that first thing, the essentially private aspect, so it is by means of an idea that I grasp a sense, and thereby think about a referent. So in that sense, I think that's exactly an instance of the kind of thing I'm talking about. So I have to be stationed at a particular location, and in virtue of that, I have I instantiate this type, but just that idea is a mode of grasping, or I would just say it's an instantiation of a mode of presentation, which is a type. It's a fine grained. So there is an idea which I have, which is my mode of my access to the sense, which is this communal thing, which then is there's a type thing and then a private instantiation of it. That's one distinction that's important for him. I don't find that problematic. I'm talking about types, even if they're, okay. The second thing is, there's all this other touchy-feely stuff that's involved in ideas that aren't just in the senses. That is part of what I want to embrace that, where Frege says that's all, and that's part of what I'm going through and that's why I think there's an important difference between concepts and characterizations, right? Concepts are much more like Fregean senses, characterizations are these richer things, all right? So now, how do I reel back, what is this idea of my perspective? So my concern was to give an account of what a perspective is, and such that it is a type. It's a type of pattern of, so ultimately, as I said, it's a disposition to interpret. It's a disposition to form certain types of cognitive structures in certain, relative to the context in which one is embedded. So you and I share a common perspective to the extent that we have common, ultimately, cognitive neural dispositions to form representations. We have different perspectives, except that we have different dispositions. Whether your perspective and my perspective are the same perspective is going to depend on our explanatory purposes. There's going to be so fine-grained. There's always going to be some similarities and some differences, right? We're both animals in the world, but we also have different histories, right? So there's going to be some similarities between me and the spider, and
Okay.
So it's going to be relative to explanatory purposes. I need perspectives to both be the kinds of things that can be socially shared, that can be communal, the sort of the social imaginary or something like that.
Yeah.
And I want them to be the kinds of things that can be incredibly fine-grained, but I don't want them to be indissolubly private in that sense, because they're still types, which could be shared.
I see.
Okay,
I see. So the minus in summary then is, as it were, a matter of the grain, right? So
yes,
the
exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
And dimensions of explanation.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to start with a compliment that has little to do with perspective, or maybe it's my perspective. But listen, congratulations. I've long not heard a talk that I thought was so rhetorically brilliant and virtuous. It was absolutely, I even know something a little bit about practical rhetoric. It was fantastic. Congratulations. I really enjoyed every minute of the rest.
Thank you. I feel like you're just saying that to be and yet, lurking beneath was a vast.
That will follow.
But what you say.
Yeah, exactly. The how.
Now, in what you said, there was actually one concept that caught my attention, because I'm going to talk to more from a completely different perspective. I'm going to give a talk about this age in literary criticism, starting in Cambridge in the 1920s, and maybe finishing, with the peeling out of deconstruction about new criticism, right? And I will call it the ecstasies of interpretation. But there was this German-speaking moment, actually, interestingly enough, a post-war, post-1945 German moment. And there is an emblematic work, and it's called das literarische Kunstwerk by somebody called Wolfgang Kaiser. And his key concept is Gestalt. And I want to briefly refer to how he uses Gestalt and then transform that into exactly 3 questions for you. Not about Kaiser, of course, that I reserve for tomorrow. Anyway, so Kaiser starts his book with a kind of morphology of elements. You could almost say an ontology of things that put together literary artwork.
Yep.
So there is verse, there is content, blah, blah, blah.
Yep.
And then he says the great achievement is really that the great authors manage to get this into a Gestalt, which implication, does it say, is ontologically impossible, because all the things belong to different ontological realms, but that's the Gestalt. And then he says 2 things. I mean, as far as the interpreter is concerned, I mean, that is uninteresting for a question, but it is funny because it's the inversion of what you did.
Yeah.
You can only recognize and evaluate a Gestalt in the Kunst der Interpretation, the art of interpretation, if you yourself are free of any perspective.
What?
So that's the German professor and director in Nazi times of the German Cultural Institute in Lisbon, in fascist Portugal. Anyway, that's what he's saying. And then, okay, now there are 3 concepts that I want to play with that he associates with Gestalt. I mean, it was also late 40s, early 50s, the great age of that concept, right? I mean, Gestalt had a resonance, everything was Gestalt. Okay. In the first place, he says that Gestalten are always precarious. Yeah? They're always precarious, and he shows that in the interpretation of poems by saying that even Hugo von Hofmannsthal, whom I admire quite a lot, in his poems, sometimes he manages Gestalt, sometimes he falls out of Gestalt. So Hugo von Hofmannsthal, by German gradings, no, by American gradings, that's an A-, B+. I mean, one of the most canonized, because Gestalt is precarious. You can never hold on to. Now, that would be my first question to you now. Would we say that perspectives in your sense are precarious, not in the sense of achievements, like writing a great poem, if that is an achievement. But anyway, for Kaiser, it would probably not be an achievement. But anyway, are they precarious? Are they precarious in the sense that sometimes we have them completely, we embrace them, and then we fall out of them? I'm recently observing that my perspective of hating the eternal winner of the German soccer championship, Bayern München, is kind of falling apart. And I won't hold on to that hatred, but somehow it doesn't work. It's precarious. That's the first question. Now the second question is that, of course, I mean, for the best poems, Kaiser would say, they are the work of genius. Now, what's genius? I think what he means by genius, they happen. Yeah, they happen to you, and there's not much you can do about that. So that would be my second question. Is your sense of you're connecting your, I think, quite impressive, and just to be polemical, phenomenological analysis more than analytical of perspectives? Does it really always have to end up how you can create consensus? I mean, you know, perspectives happen to us, and do we really, I mean, the second question is, do we really have a chance to transform them into consensus? And then the third question is, I would actually say, you know, that disagreeing on the basis of having perspectives, and that doesn't always lead into disagreement, is what I would like to call the fabric of life, the fabric of existence. I mean, we live in perspectives, we live in disagreement, and you know, being as old as I would say that's what makes life worthwhile. Isn't there, especially among Western intellectualism, a terrorism of consensus? So after your beautiful analysis of perspectives, etc., at the end, can we say, 5 minutes board, when you tried how to show how one can transform that into consensus, I actually, to end up on a strong diagnostic, I think this famous rift that goes not only through American society, but through all societies, even in the completely concrete consens EU societies, that has to do with the terrorism of consensus. The one side, we intellectuals and liberals have to completely disagree. We force the others into agreement too. Not to disagree, we have to always agree. Okay, thank you so much.
All right. So my answer to all three questions is like sorta, kinda, not really. So what I was trying to do was lay out a notion of perspective, which then could get applied and like we can use to talk about particular situations, right?
And I will use it.
So about the precariousness, you said sometimes we have them and then we fall out of them, right? So I think on the one hand, so I think some perspectives are deeply ossified. Some people's having of perspectives is deeply ossified. In the caricature of the that I possess as a Western intellectual, it's the rubes who never went to school. They're just like living in one perspective. They never thought about anything else. They're just stuck with one perspective, right? What I did when I went to university was liberate myself. I got a liberal education in which I played with many different perspectives and I achieved perspectival fluidity. And so for me, the risk is not of being stuck in one perspective all the time, but rather of having lost my mooring, right? Of being too relativist and shifting all the time.
You were making a difference between commonplace and perspective, taking that seriously. So yes, commonplace people are stuck in, but my point would be, is it not also precarious among them?
Right, so that's what, so I just gave you like a caricature of a split, but that's itself like a super unrealistic, whatever. So so this is a harder fine grain. So I do want, on the one hand, I think it's really important for the analysis of perspectives to explain how they can lure us into complacency and have a kind of ossification, and I want them to do the kind of work of explaining the way in which like ideology freezes thought, something like that. But I also want to explain the sense in which like, it's precarious, you kind of get it and then you lose it, and then, and so I think we can see the same notion as being in play there, and that's just like how flexible, just think about these dispositions, right? And so I think for most adult Western people, and I would include the rubes that, we're competent with a range of different perspectives, which both happen to us and we can take on, right? And so, so that's my first thing. The second thing is about the idea of genius and agency, I think. Like, does it just happen to you or not? And so that's what I really want with the way I have the Gestalt figure, but also, this is to me one of the most important things about Gestalt, but also why I talk about this, about the endorsing is neither necessary so sufficient. It's something that happens to you, but that also you can try to do, right? And it's this really interesting, I think, theoretically really interesting middle ground between partially but not entirely under voluntary control. And so it's a matter of like, partly at a time, I can reallocate attention, I can try to take on a new perspective. That's not guaranteed to succeed, but I can make some significant stride often. But also then, across time, I set up habits of interpretation, which I fall in and out of. And part of my agency is cultivating habits of interpretation, but also that's something I don't have full control over. So I'm going to try to keep it, I have much more to say on each of these things, but I'm trying to keep it short. I love the idea that part of one way of thinking about genius is having this power to like impose, right, to make it happen. And so I like to think more about that. And then the last thing is about the terrorism of consensus. And so, I mean, again, I want to emphasize like, look, even like us nice professors who are very similar in lots of ways, we still might have perspectival disagreement, right? Like we're like locked in some kind of, what's that?
But we never vote Republican, ever.
Right, exactly. So there's a lot of things that are just totally off the table. So, and we're like locked in our little self, super complacent, whatever, little echo chamber. And yet within that, there are still perspectival disagreements, which I want to be able to diagnose and explain, like about debates about movies or about, profound moral matters, right? But I also want to say, I don't want to just say that, I think there really are, there's not just, you say a terrorism of consensus, like, there's degrees of difference and similarity, right? And so, like, some of my neighbors, there's both really important perspectival similarity and really important perspectival difference. And then we're all sort of in the same perspective relative to some others who are different, right? So I want to use this kind of notion of and this goes back to the question about like individuating what is a perspective and when is there sameness and difference of perspective. And there's going to be degrees and for certain purposes, and it's relative to explanatory. Yeah. So I agree that, I guess just to say, I think that a part of what I'd like to say is that I would like the way in which perspectives generate a kind, are self-perpetuating and self-justifying. I want to use that to sort of explain why we don't even notice the amount of consensus internally that we have, because we're focusing on the differences and whatever. And so to really be like, yeah, there is, you know, we're thinking we're in this little disagreement, but we're not noticing the broader agreement. But also to emphasize, some of these disagreements really are very profound, right, and risky, and can shatter, I mean, like, whatever. Everything seems to be going to hell in a handbasket, so, you know, I want to sort of explain that.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Thank you. I'm nervous that, can you field the questions? I don't know.
Kayla.
Thank you for your talk, it was really great. I just want to ask you about something that you said at the very end of your talk. You said that we have to trust people to engage in sincere conversation with them. And I was curious about the connection between that thought and the thought that if what we care about is different, and the point of engaging someone in conversation is to try to get them to care about what I care about, so that they can see my perspective, so that then maybe if they are able to inhabit that perspective, at least to some degree, then they can learn to care about that too. What do you think, how is that connected to trust in your view? And what is the significance of that in our ability to engage in like democratic conversations where we want to learn from each other and have hope?
Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I mean, I wish I had something better to say. So, I mean, again, there's like degrees of trust, right? And degrees of, so like, I mean, there are people I really think I should not be engaged in conversation with because A, it's either going to be a waste of time or it's going to make me worse. Because either they're going to be manipulating me or they're going to be just like barraging me with thoughts, even if they're not trying to manipulate me, that are, I mean, so I think that, and in that sense I really deeply don't trust them, right? For me to even engage in conversation and persist in the conversation in an open-minded way rather than like, I gotta try to convince them, you know, like I have an instrumental end. So my ability to try on an alternative perspective might be just instrumentally useful in that like, all right, I know where you're coming from, and so I can say the things that are going to help to change your mind because I know where we need to end up, and so I want to get you over there, right? So that's like effective manipulation, which might be a good thing, right? And it's not true manipulation because I'm appealing to you in your rational agency and trying to move you rhetorically, you know, into the place. But that's not genuinely open-minded, right? I'm there like using my perspective and my understanding of your perspective to sort of move you in the conversation, right? I'm trying to hold on to as much as I, you know. So for me to be genuinely open-minded in my conversation, in a conversation, I need to like be open to the thought that you have aspects of the reality that you've hooked onto and prioritized that I should be open to, right? And so that is itself a kind of trust, right? And then there's degrees of openness and topics, right? You might be like, okay, I can really learn from this person with respect to like cooking, you know, but I'm not going to talk to them about this, you know, so yeah.
Okay, so how do you determine what is the threshold of what?
Well, there's two things. One is like degree and the other is like domain, right? And I guess all I would say is I think the things I would emphasize, like to more normal philosophers, that a lot of the things we go on fall outside like the standard purview of philosophical. So it's something like I suss out like how you hold eye contact, your patterns. So what Iris Berger talks about like a texture of being, right? Like a way of being in conversation, a way of inhabiting space. And part of that is like, I use my characterization of you, right? I use like, I'm like picking up, like, are you paying attention? What kind of car do you drive? What do you, you know, like I'm using all that to form a characterization of you and to think like, is this the kind of person that I can, that's the only resource I have, you know, in some sense. But, and I would emphasize that I would emphasize that we're using very like low level, subtle, intuitive social competences in forming those judgments. And, I think they're fairly, somewhat reliable, but, but if you're just like looking for a doctrinal test, right? I will engage in an open-minded conversation with you if you pass these, that's not how we actually move forward, and that's not how we should move forward in thinking about perspectival open-mindedness. All right?
Great.
Hey, I wanted to ask you a cognitive science philosophy mind question. Like, the view you have on perspectives, do you characterize it as like what I call a layer cake view, or more of like a transcendental view? So like on the layer cake view, you've got perspectives, which are individuated one way, and you've got Fodorian concepts, which is totally separate faculty, and then you've got a language of thought that deals with the rational stuff. On like transcendental view might be like more of a condition of possibility view. Perspectives are a condition of possibility because without salience, you only get the idea of salience through being, living and having to maintain yourself. And then all the other forms of meaning derive from the appearance-reality distinction that comes from that, et cetera, et cetera.
Great. All right. I have a transcendentalist layered view. So it's a condition on being an agent in the world, I think, of engaging in cognition, that you're parsing, selecting, connecting, and responding, right? So I think we have that in common with any animal. Or all animals, all agents do that in some way, right? We as humans, especially adult humans, use concepts in order to, and so to just have that, some ways of like differential response, learn differential response to stimuli which cluster in these ways. That doesn't have to have categories which are sharp and combine in stable ways and have really replicable features. It just needs to have like degrees of similarity and response to. Okay, so you could, I think I'm willing to characterize a range of non-human animals as largely engaging in like perspectival interpretation of the world using characterizations. We humans have concepts understood in a more compositional, like say Fodorian kind of way. We have ways of individuating and tagging features and objects which impose genuine like categories and kinds, right? So that's like a layer on top of this basic capacity, but it then transforms that capacity by like making it sort of atomic and kind-like, right? And so I think when I, as an adult human, my intuitive mode of engagement, my characterizations, and my pass through concepts, right? So when I'm thinking about you as a man. I mean, a bunch of other things too, but now like philosopher of mind, whatever Dudu can talk about Fodor. And those are all like concepts which can, like I am attributing properties to you using concepts understood in a kind of atomic combinatorial way. And then those are the anchors for characterizations. They're the anchors and elements of these characterizations, which are these more complex nodes of interpretation.
So you get both. I guess if I'm understanding you correctly, the layer element is what gets you out of the problems with holism and perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think, those are some of the kinds of reasons I'm persuaded by the standard philosophical arguments for But the other thing that's important to me is I think dual systems theorists or whatever have too much of a bifurcation between the layers. And so I think that there's more, I'm a bit of a holist in the sense that I think what it is to be, maybe for some social kinds like man or woman or maybe races, I don't even think that, there really is this, I'm persuaded by something there's something like an atom which has a function of being a pointer, and then there's a lot, there's all this stuff. So the line between the concept or what goes into the conceptual role and a broader characterization, I want to be so I sometimes think of this as an atom surrounded by a whirling wind of characterizations. But the line like that.
Yeah, thank you so much for this very lively and
It's a
engaging
lot of writing.
I have a lot of questions.
Also, you were furrowed brow for the whole time. It was very nice.
I'll limit it to 2. What I'm going to do is very briefly give you a sense of how I'm reading you, then raise 2 objections so that you can tell me why I'm wrong. So, based on what Greg was just asking, I take you to be responding at least in some way to the first question that's guiding Kant's first critique, right? What can I know? So if we're wondering how knowledge is possible, I'm hearing you as saying, okay, well, perspectives seem to be one condition for the possibility of knowledge. What are the conditions for the possibility of having a perspective? Space and time. That's totally uncontroversial. It seems to me when you were talking about other possible conditions, right? You were talking about abstract domains, and I heard you say that if I want to talk about other conditions that maybe narrow my perspective, if I want to talk about, say, socialization or normativity or anything like that, historical sedimentation, that's all going to be abstract, and I'm always going to talk about those things by analogy to position in space and time. And so my worry about that,
I don't think that, but I see why you think I thought that.
Okay, oh good. My worry about that then is that if I'm Husserl, I might say, well, what if those structures that you're claiming to be abstract really are just already part of space and time, right? And so if I can only speak of them by analogy, that's because there is no other way to speak about them. They already are that. The other question, if those are not abstract, I want to ask a little bit about aptness, because it seems to me one of the criteria for distinguishing between perspectives, trying to figure out which one is more apt than another, is that a more apt perspective will impute actually instantiated features of the thing that I'm trying to describe.
Yes.
And what Werner Heisenberg would say about that is, look, you might be doing a bit of metaphysical realism if you're willing to admit that the Ptolemaic model of the cosmos is wrong, right? What you're saying is that doesn't match up with the phenomena correctly or something. But Heisenberg's going to say, if I want to be really strict about this, the intuitions I have about where a planet is in the sky, every night at this time, I take a snapshot, that's my intuition, I see it. And then what I have to do is posit this like elliptical orbit that the planet is tracing, which doesn't really exist, right? I'm just, I would say, schematizing in order to figure out this causal relationship between different planets and their gravitational forces. So my worry is, how am I always going to be imputing things that are really there to the system when if I'm choosing Kepler's system over Ptolemy's, it's not on the basis of any actually instantiated features that either of those systems have.
Okay, that is exactly the worry I was like, I'm going to come into this room and somebody's going to be worried about that. So thank you for, Okay, there was a ton there. Let me see if I can get it all lined up. Okay, so first, there was this magic word transcendental. I went for it. I took the bait and swallowed it. But you said you're hearing me as talking about Kant and what can I know. And I talked about knowing how to go on. But I didn't really talk about knowledge, right? I just talked about sort of functional cognition, being able to navigate my way around the world. I'm not an epistemologist. I don't know what knowledge is. I'm just talking about what it takes to, to be able to navigate be a finite agent navigating the world in real time in a way that answers to my purposes, right? So now we need to have a conversation about what knowledge would be, such that whether I'm meeting those conditions or not, right? So that's my first and foremost thing is I'm a philosopher of mind, and part of what I'm doing in talking to epistemologists is saying, you people should pay attention to this messier phenomenon. You think you can just ignore it, but it's relevant to the phenomena we're talking about because it's part of our rational agency. It's one of the factors that contributes to understanding. I don't know how it relates to knowledge because I don't really know what knowledge is. Okay, so that was the first thing I said. Second, what I wanted to say. Second was about your word, talk about knowledge. Second thing was, I think that there was just like a little bit of a mismatch there. So in the second section, what I was doing was talking about the phenomenon of perception and doing some analysis of that in order to say, here's some ingredients I want to show up somehow in my analysis of perspectives. So I was saying that if you're going to make sense of an idea of point of view, you need some idea of structure, and that is something more than spatial structure, temporal structure is what we're going to need. And so, and those structures in that sense are abstract, they're not concrete. I wasn't saying that the perspectives themselves needed to, the thing that we're going to, so I was using that to get a desiderata on an analysis of what perspectives are. I wasn't saying that the perspectives themselves are going to necessarily be abstract in that, once we make the analysis of interpretation. So in particular, I would want to emphasize the way in which I, as a perspectival agent, my perspective is embodied, right? And it's drawing on images and feelings, and that's part of what affordances are supposed to be getting in there, right? So the target of analysis has to include a bunch of sensitivities, which are not just given by space and time. But and so in that sense, it's more. But it doesn't mean that they might be implemented in a bodily way, drawing on embodied resources, all that kind of stuff. Okay. Okay, that was the second point. The third point was then about relativism. So I am buying. I am a kind of realist, but I think of myself as a kind of moderate realist. In particular, I want to say, look, there are multiple legitimate taxonomies, right? And what, right, so, but I think there are some perspectives are better than others. So we can make relative comparisons. And then when we have this kind, so just to stick with the Kepler and Ptolemy, I think when we have a sort of perspectival clash and we're like, whoa, but are the lower level features, or are these features actually instantiated? I think what we do is go down a level and see, oh, what lower level features can we agree about that we're imputing, and how are we claiming them to be distributed in our clashing higher level taxonomies? And so then we got to get to work on assessing whether these lower level features are present and how they're distributed, and we do like scientific tests or other kinds of tests to try to assess that. So if for the sake of, so if you're engaged in like, say, evolutionary anthropology, and you're trying to figure out whether, tool use was causally driven more by hunting or by gathering, right? And so which gender was more, there's a debate between androcentric and gynocentric theories of the evolution of tool use, right? So that's going to be couched at using one taxonomy at a higher level. So then if we're clashing, we're going to look at lower features that are lower level features relative to that taxonomy. Maybe stuff about like how hard were the tools, what was the utility, but there's all, we're going to be talking about causes and all kinds of complicated things. You might have two physicists. One's like a theoretical physicist, and one's a physicist interested in working on engineering, right? They're going to have different taxonomies, but if they're disagreeing, they're going to go down to a lower level feature. So I am committed to there being some lowest level reality, but I also that out of which all these different taxonomies are applying to. But I'm not committed to there being like a totally hierarchical relation among them, where they nicely nest, or where they all capture all the facts. Or, it could be very messy. I'm committed to there being multiple taxonomies at multiple layers of analysis, levels of analysis that are going to be useful for certain kinds of purposes. So I know that's not going to be satisfying to you. I can see from your brow still being furrowed that you're not satisfied. But I would say the two things. One, I am a realist in this modernism. I hope that a lot of what I said you could buy and not buy the realist assumption, right? So all this stuff about diagnosing disagreement and whatever, and even certain kinds of what it would mean to be internally apt, and certain kinds of comparisons between perspectives. You could go along with me on all that. And then I want to say my realism is a moderate one in the sense that I think it, like all these different taxonomies and perspectives ground down into something or are based on something in common. But I admit that that's a kind of like regulated, that's a kind of faith, a methodological faith or something like that. I have no direct demonstration on that because, like, how could you get it? All right? I got her to nod.
I'm going to add a follow-up question on that because that seems irresolute given the other things you said. So at one point, very, very quickly, you asked us to imagine an ideal epistemic agent. And you said an ideal epistemic agent would, him, her, itself, you know, be committed to understanding the world's via perspectives.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
And so that, you know, one way to draw up that line of thought is to say then, you know, the idea of a perspectiveless God's eye point of view that came up very quickly in Seb's comment is unintelligible. If we start from that idea, then we can deny the intelligibility of this, you know, kind of boogeyman alternative that would give us a kind of knowledge that, you know, was underlying some of Vidya's worries, I feel like. And once we have that, it's an easy next step to saying, we don't need to think that there is always going to be some kind of ground level, low level features that are shared by all intelligible perspectives, and so we give up on that.
Right, so I'm saying you go for that, and I still want it. You know, but I'm saying like we can like so something like I'm committed to something. So let's just get us here. Okay, we're all have our clashing perspectives, and we actually have very different, you know, somewhat different purposes and whatever, right? So, like, there are gonna be multiple perspectives, you know, because there's answerable to different practical needs, and you know, like that's the flux of life as it actually is, lived by, you know, agents in the world, is gonna always ordinarily involve multiple perspectives. All right, but now we move to this idealized situation where we're not interested in practical action, we've abstracted, we're not acquiring information over time, we have all the information and we have no like practical purposes. Surely perspectives drop away there, aren't they really not, you know, they're just heuristics for managing. No, I say even at that point we need perspectives. Something like, and so I might say there, like the ideal perspective would be that which, like at a Persian end of inquiry, you know, you're getting rid of the practical, but we're focusing on getting all the information, like we're disputing, reconciling the best we can, it's kind of internalist, but like we're trying to get something, okay, so we're at the end of inquiry, we've gotten all our information matched up, we've taxonomized everything, and we know we have the statistical distributions of, you know, lower order features in the world. That still doesn't dictate a particular taxonomy, right? Probably doesn't. Maybe it does, but probably doesn't. But even if it did, there would be that would still be a taxonomizing, collecting like as like, and connecting in certain kinds of ways. So it would still be perspectival, right? So maybe if we could even get you and me together to a common perspective at the end of inquiry. Now we're here, we're our ideal agents, we're here at the end of inquiry. We're still perspectival, but like the great hope is that we will have Persian-wise like come to the end of inquiry to a single perspective. And I think like regulatively, you and I engaging in debate requires us to kind of be assuming methodologically we can get somewhere and we can reconcile difference and whatever. So now we're here, and now what are we thinking about? You know, I still think we're thinking about, I think we're thinking about the world, and the world is but I agree that that's like my posit that's motivating me, you know, but it's like,
But here's like two just quick thoughts. One is, it sounds like the kind of core example you're most interested in is the CDC FDA example, where there's shared, you know, information and persistent disagreement in spite of that, and we invoke the concept of perspective to make sense of that shared disagreement. And then we explain, you know, the persistence in part in terms of the kind of attention, you know, differences in attention. And so, you know, where differences in attention can be stark, as you brought up, but the change blindness experiments show, you know, just different goals in looking at things can really lead you to completely ignore other things, but of course things that would be available. And then I think as you're rightly tracking, the word, I think this was underlying Craig's implication of transcendental, is imagine someone who is a kind of radical pluralist about the ontology of things in the case of Chang. He thinks you can't both be a phlogiston theorist and modern chemical theorist.
Right.
And he thinks, they both are tracking real properties of things in the world. And that's incompatible with what you're saying.
Right.
It can't be
Exactly.
like, oh, we just, And he's going to say, we should, this is back to the comment about the, terrorism consensus, we should give up on the idea that what we want is for those two.
Right.
What we really want is a plurality of research programs that are each tracking real features of things in the world that can tell us more. And they shouldn't even try to talk to each other. It's a waste of everybody's time. It's a waste of their individual time. And in terms of the knowledge produced, it's a waste of time because they're not focused then on producing the relevant kind of knowledge they would be producing.
Okay.
So what do you think?
All right. So first, one reason I focus on like the CDC and the FDA and whatever, is to illustrate, even if you're being like a sober-minded, sciencey kind of, whatever, interesting, you still should care about perspectives or whatever. But it's too strong to say so I'm trying to lure the regular philosophers over to care about perspectives, but that's too strong to say that's my core case, right? I'm also really interested in differences in interpretation, like in art, and ways in which, historical texts vary, so I want the notion to, right, and politics. So I want the notion to go. So not the core case, but yes, and particularly a case that raises issues of realism in a particularly potent way. I also really agree, given where we are and given how perspectives work, and I hope I contribute to this, why it might be really good to have distinct research programs operating differently, right? Because they're exploring different sort of taxonomies, and they're more likely to highlight really different aspects of the world. And we are blinkered and limited, right? And so our main task, at least now, is to find out more, including unknown unknowns, things we're not even. So I can celebrate a methodological pluralism now, given where we are, given how, So the question is really like the end game, And there, just I would say, I like, sort of like a Sandra Mitchell, I think is cool in thinking about the ways in which, different sciences are really different. So there's things other than science, but different sciences might be really genuinely, coherently, and legitimately different in the scale and level and purpose of their scientific enterprises. And I think this is more than just a feel-good faith, but I think that it is a condition on trying to talk to each other when it makes sense to talk to each other, that they assume that there's some common reality that they're talking about. And here, I don't know, you're the chair, and we're out of time, but so I think here, just because I think some people may know or find it useful, so I think of, so Alexander Nehamas has this, I think, lovely paper called Critical Monism as a Regulative Ideal, where he's sort of saying, well, look, the idea of an interpretation for a text, right, isn't that, he's responding to the idea that the sort of deconstructionists worry that that's a folly and a fantasy and a hegemonic imposition that shuts down conversation. And he says, look, we should think of, it is critical monism, the idea that we come to a common one sort of view, one interpretation, that is a condition on the kind of thing we're doing. It's a regulative ideal for our inquiry. But that doesn't mean that there is one set of facts which would be an interpretation which would settle things forever, partly because we ask different questions on different occasions, and that changes what we're paying attention to. But it's, an interpretation is still better than another interpretation if it can encompass more, these internal virtues, encompassing more on, hopefully simplicity is a consideration, but it's only a guide, whatever.
Can I jump in with an example and see?
I am merely the speaker, it's noon,
This will be our
I'm
last
okay
question.
with whatever,
Good,
it's
good.
on you guys now.
Good.
Then we'll have lunch.
Yeah, but I want to hear about this. I really want to question that idea. So let me take the case that I had yesterday. So Antigone, right? So some of us are inclined to think of Antigone as some kind of feminist emancipatory play. Let's call this an interpretation, right? We side with Antigone, right? How could Creon do this?
Yeah.
I think Sophocles intended, and the Athenians read the play, as a defense of Creon's perspective. That's stupid Antigone.
Yeah.
This is how bad it is in Athens. We have those people.
Yeah.
I think this was in they were like shocked by Antigone, right? We are shocked by Creon, right? So I think that the facts are, there's like Creon, he's the head of the state, Antigone does these things, they are illegal, and etc., etc. Those are the facts, right? Whether you interpret, so let's call the feminist interpretation one perspective, and the Creon interpretation, let's call this the Iranian interpretation, right? So you have the Iranian interpretation, and you have the New School interpretation, and I think both are interpretations, and in this particular case, the question is, does it even make sense to think of those interpretations of getting something about the play right or wrong? Right, and so in this case, I would say, the basic level facts that you characterize, the commonality is what's in the text, right? Creon is this dude, and Antigone is that woman, and she has a sister, right? Those are the lower level facts. And the interpretations in this particular case, I would say, right, are not even in the business of, being in a relevant way tied to those lower level facts. And this is why interpretation and perspective is interesting, because there's a way in which it doesn't contribute anything to the propositional. It's as it were between the lines of the propositional.
So now that we're out of time, I mean, I really do disagree, even for this case of art, right? I do not claim that there is one. So one thing that I wanted to, so there's a thing that, so talking about the ambiguous Gestalt figure can be misleading in some ways. I mean, it's helpful and misleading in some ways because it is a bistable perspective, right? Or bistable image. So there are two very different and incompatible images which cannot be entertained at the same time. I think it's really important that that is the case, and perspectives can be like that. And there is no reconciliation of these two, and yet the figure is a certain way. There's only one figure on the page, right? And what you're doing then is going down to lower level features which don't have an inherent significance, and you're like, okay, let's see that bump there. There is a thing there. It's like a distribution of black and white on the page, pixels, right? Those are lower level facts, but they don't come interpreted, they don't have interpretation. But what they generate is a kind of bistable interpretation. And there's something better, which is than having just one of those, which is having access to both of those. And then there's something better, which is having access to both those and being able to say something about what the relations are, what those lower level features are, such that they underwrite them and whatever, right? So that is, it's not that it is nothing, it's untethered to the lower order features. There is a lower order set of features. Now, you might say, oh, but you're already focusing on just a picture of capitulation. That's like just one layer down, right? And so you might have to, keep on. But for any disagreement is going to be couched at the level of, we're disagreeing about these features. We go down a level. And so I'm not committed to it all could work out fairly nicely. Everybody can all agree at the end of the inquiry. There might be these indissolubly distinct, incompatible, but it would still be, there's a kind of critical monism in understanding the relation among those at a meta level. And then just very last thing, there's this question to go back to the idea of my perspective and whatever. I want to say there is a kind of virtue, now, so one thing I tried to not say to you at the time to keep the conversation moving along is, what does it mean this my in my perspective, right? And so one thing that I am inclined to is to think that a self is more the product of a self is something like a repertoire of perspectives and defaults to move among perspectives in certain kinds of ways. So rather than the self being antecedent and then going out and reaching out and picking up, I'm inclined to something like the opposite order of explanation, but that's gets kind of kooky. Me, given that I went away to college and became the person, I have a repertoire of perspectives, right? And so that idea about my perspective is itself an idealization, an imposition of a kind of stability that may not be there. I am committed, and again, you might just deny this, but I think that it's a virtue to have some measure of as much agency as possible to have a rich perspectival repertoire, which I have agency over the exercise of, and which hangs together in a higher order way. So I have a kind of Nietzschean idea of selfhood and character, on which it's not that it's all one thing. Complexity is to be celebrated, and these amazing aesthetic ways in which the different things could be, you're using the ugliness and transforming it and bringing it together in very higher order ways. But it should kind of make sense. So it's okay and even to be celebrated if I'm like very momish in this one context and very like analytic philosopher in this other context, and then touchy-feely lit person, that's okay. That multiplicity is a virtue, but yet it should hang together in some higher order way, and that hanging together could be super complex and interesting and like not logical consistency or anything like that, but it's a hanging together, right? That's the end.
Thank you so much.